knowledge comes from the Western world. Does anybody know what the Western world means?
America, Canada,
Europe, right? Middle East even would be considered the Western because it's part of that cultural sharing. Huh? Yeah, that's this industrial idea. So we get this we have this predetermined knowledge about the Western world. We know about it. We live in the Western world. We don't really get to know a lot about the Eastern history. You don't really get into like the nitty gritty of Eastern history until college. So that's why it's really cool that you guys actually get to learn a little bit about China and ancient China, because it is one of the first civilizations, and it's actually one of the longest lasting civilizations that we know of, right? So it's really cool that you get to learn this, and it gives you a new perspective. I think it's very important to get a new perspective on other cultures because it helps you understand them and not be ignorant towards them, to have a little bit of knowledge, and it just helps you be a better, well-rounded student and a more well-rounded person.
Another huge thing on that one is that's also how the United States and Western Hemisphere was won. The stuff that he's going to tell you about how their country is, there's a lot of reasons a lot of these people fled those countries to come to the United States to help build the Transcontinental Railroad, to help build the United States. So learning about how all of these other countries are and how bad they are compared to what we are in the United States are accustomed to is the reason why people want to come to the United States.
So you guys are going to watch a video, and then we're going to talk about this video. There's some things in here that are kind of interesting. I'd pay attention and kind of get an idea of what we're talking about, kind of this about China. And then I'm going to ask you guys some questions so we can kind of have a discussion and talk about them.
Using the link in the description. This is China. It's big. Most of your stuff probably comes from there, and they have a solar farm shaped like a planet. But most interestingly, China is old. For as long as people have been talking about history, there has been a China to point to. So how did China become the world's oldest continuous civilization? What's a dynasty? Who's Confucius? And is it ever okay to just bury people alive? Well, let's find out. China was born along two great rivers, the Yellow and the Yangtze. People began farming rice and millet here around 8000 BCE. Silk cultivation would follow at around 3000 BCE, and silk would remain a Chinese trade secret for thousands of years. But these early farmers had a problem, the Yellow River, which had this nasty habit of flooding everyone to death. Enter you. Well, no, not you, but like you the engineer. He spent 13 years traveling up and down the land fighting the floods. So dedicated was he to his task that he walked past his own home on several occasions, but never went inside to visit his wife or newborn child. You built canals that led the excess floodwater into the fields or out to sea, and so stopped the floods. Everyone was very impressed with you. You get named king, and so starts China's first dynasty, the Xia dynasty. What's a dynasty, you might ask? A dynasty is a family that rules over China. If the family dies or is overthrown, a new family takes over. Eventually, China will be ruled by dynasties from now up until 1911 CE. It kind of tells you a lot about Chinese culture that one of their greatest heroes is a hydraulic engineer. The Xia are said to have reigned from around 2100 to 1600 BCE. We used to think that the Xia were fictional, which isn't wrong, but isn't really right either. We have evidence like bronze tools, the remains of cities, and tombs near Eritao and Yanqi that point to an urban civilization existing around 2100 to 1600 BC. But it probably wasn't an actual unified state, more a collection of culturally similar cities and villages. It was once believed that a distinct Chinese culture spread out from the Xia to the rest of China, but now examples of dozens of Neolithic cultures ranging from Manchuria to Guangdong have been unearthed. None is really more advanced than the others. Chinese civilization seems to have been forged by all of these cultures mixing together. By the 16th century BCE, the Chinese had learned to mix tin, lead, and copper together to form bronze. Warriors riding a new Eurasian import called the chariot took these fancy bronze weapons and clobbered the Shah to death. These people founded the Shang dynasty, which was like an actual dynasty. Sorry, Shah, but you just weren't. At the Shang capital of Anyang, archaeologists have dug up tens of thousands of so-called oracle bones. Priests would scratch questions for the gods on these bones and then applied heat to them. The heat would crack the bones, and those cracks would be red as a response from the gods. The incredible thing about these oracle bones is that the questions were written on them. The Chinese independently invented writing, something that's only been done around 5 times in human history. These bones have recognizably Chinese characters. We can still read a fair amount of them. This script on the oracle bones is the ancestor of modern Chinese. The last of the pre-imperial 3 dynasties is the Zhou, who overthrew the Shang around 1045 BCE. They would still be there nearly 800 years later. China's later dynasties wouldn't last half as long. The Zhou came from the Wei Valley and were vassals to the Shang. But getting tired of that, they called up their armies, marched into Shang territory, and whooped them at the Battle of Miuyi. The defeated Shang king fled back to his palace, had himself a little bit of a cry, and then burned the palace down with himself inside. This posed a question to the Chinese. The Shang ruled because heaven had given them the right to rule. How could the Zhou just come along and overthrow them? Surely the Zhou were in the wrong here. Luckily, the Zhou had an answer. Heaven had dumped the Shang. Why? Well, according to ancient Chinese historian Sima Qian, the last Shang king may have hosted some festive orgies and written some extremely pornographic poems and tortured a bunch of people, and maybe, just maybe, built himself a giant alcohol lake, and inside of previously said alcohol lake built a meat forest. Heaven frowns on that kind of behavior. This resulted in the Shang losing heaven's mandate, which heaven was happy to transfer to a more virtuous people, like the Zhou. From now, heaven would throw storms, earthquakes, and peasant uprisings at rulers that it saw as unfit. If rulers didn't listen and change, the mandate of heaven would fall from their grasp and into another's. The mandate of heaven became central to Chinese politics, as different dynasties lost and claimed the mandate for the next few thousand years. Under the Zhou, China's first classical texts were written. Irrigation and flood control sprang up, along with a large bureaucracy. A network of canals were built to transport food and luxuries. Zhou elite families could live in fancy walled cities and enjoy poetry and silk clothing, while commanding large armies and taxing the peasants to death. It was a time of immense change. Iron appeared in China around the 9th century BCE, about 1,000 years later than in the Middle East. But the Chinese quickly became experts. Europe and the Middle East could not figure out how to melt iron, and so were forced to use wrought iron, which is terrible. By the 4th century BCE, the Chinese were using heat-resistant clay in their furnaces, which allowed them to reach temperatures of over 1,537 degrees Celsius. So they could liquefy iron and cast it into molds. This technology wouldn't reach Europe for another 1,800 years. This gave the Chinese much stronger tools and weapons that could be produced on a massive scale. Trade kicked off as the population soared to 15 million and cities turned into manufacturing centers. Chinese silk has been discovered as far away as Germany in the 6th century BCE, suggesting that the famous Silk Road was already emerging. The Zhou started using money, which was a novel idea at the time. It was shaped like knives or spades, which seems inconvenient, but they were figuring things out. The Zhou kingdom had an issue though. It was very decentralized. It was a feudal state, so the king handed out his lands to lords. But these local lords began to amass more and more power, and the Zhou began to lose control of their own kingdom. In 1771 BCE, the Zhou capital was sacked, and they fled to a new capital at Luoyang. The Zhou still had about 500 years left in them, but at this point they were just puppets, so much more powerful vassals. This ended the Western Zhou period and began the Eastern Zhou period. This period is divided into 2 parts, both named after the historical texts that record them, the Spring and Autumn Annals and the Warring States Annals. At the beginning of the Spring and Autumn period, 148 states were all fighting to be top dog. This whittled down to about 30 or so, and in the highly volatile Warring States period, brought it down to 7, and then 3, and then finally 1. But troubled times bring new ideas. At around the same time, the warring city-states of ancient Greece gave us Socrates, and the competing Vedic kingdoms of India brought us Mahavira and the Buddha. In ancient China, the most important philosopher in East Asian history is about to be born. Master Kong, or Confucius as he's known to us, lived a fairly uneventful life. A failed civil servant, dying in 479 BCE without ever having wielded any real power or influence. But he had managed to gather a small group of followers who recorded his sayings in the Analects. Confucius's philosophy was concerned with the chaos that was destroying China. He wanted to restore order to a world that was falling apart. To do this, Confucius advocated a system of 5 hierarchical relationships. The 5 relationships were ruler to subject, husband to wife, father to son, older brother to younger brother, and friend to friend. The younger partner was always supposed to respect and honor the older or a more male partner. Yeah, Confucius, as a man from thousands of years ago, wasn't really great when it came to women's. So keep that in mind. Most of these relationships were within the family, with the father holding the highest position. This led to a tradition of filial piety, still important in East Asia today. Filial piety means to be good to one's parents, to respect them, to follow their orders, and to act in a way that positively reflects on them. It worked the other way too. Parents were supposed to provide the best care possible for their children and make sure they were safe and their futures secure. Within this system, family came before anything else. Confucius emphasized a concept called Ren, which roughly translates to benevolence or humanity. This virtue was key to Confucius's golden rule, which is, do not do unto others what you would not wish done to yourself. Confucius believed that if everyone followed their role and acted with benevolence, then society would work perfectly. The ruler especially needed to be benevolent because they were the one that set the example for everyone else.
All right.
Confucius wasn't very long. If everybody would have followed his teachings.
Yeah, if they did. That's the biggest thing.
And that's kind of the difference in there. Like Confucianism, it's not a religion, but it's an idea. So if you sit there and you think about other ideas as a way to control the masses, the same thing of Jesus, Christianity, and things like that, do unto others as you do unto yourself, love your neighbor, things like that. Those are the same throughout all of these time periods, just spoken by different people and in different manners. You know what I mean? Even whenever we get to Japan and the way of the samurai, okay? The same idea that is present is still present in all these other people. They're there. The idea of Confucianism, Taoism, things like that. So.
All right. So what's some things you guys saw in that video that kind of popped out to you?
Advanced in some portions and some
Okay.
like they were advanced in like how they made iron, and then didn't necessarily like they were late to finding it though.
Well, yeah, they were a little bit late, but they advanced it quickly. So they were late to find it.
Figured out how to make bronze.
So they in the early days they had bronze, right? They did have bronze, but then from bronze they went to iron. What do you think is a significant, like, what do you think is so much significant about iron than bronze?
A lot more tough.
A lot more tough. It's stronger. What else? It's more durable, right? If it bends, it goes back to its original spot, right? Bronze, if you bent it, sometimes it would stay bent. It wouldn't always go back to its original shape. So you kind of have iron allowed for better tools, right? So if you have better tools, you have more production. If you have better production, you have more people. That's why their population grew to almost 15 million, which is a lot of people. And still to this day, they have one of the largest population centers in the world next to China. Both of them always fight back and forth between each other. So what else? What else did you guys see? There's a lot of stuff in that video.
Very honorable.
Very honorable. So they have a system based on honor of but also at age and sex, right? So we'll get into that a little bit more later. But their system of government and everything is based on respecting your elders. So those of who are older than you. So that's why I put this last couple of thoughts. So you have your friends group, right? There is an oldest of your friends group, right? So that person would have the most respect because they are the oldest. And then it would kind of trickle down after that point. So every person, there's still respect that is reciprocated back and forth, but the most respected person is the oldest person or the male of the group. It's usually how it worked. What else? What else did you guys see?
Kind of crazy too.
What do you mean?
That guy burned himself in his own house.
Well, yeah, he had a mental breakdown because he was losing his palace, right? What else? How did they transfer between dynasties? What did they say?
The family either dies out or they get murdered.
Okay, and what do they get their rulingness from? What heaven? What's that called? The mandate of heaven, right? So the mandate of heaven is based off of how you treat your people and how you are as a ruler. So do you think a lake full of alcohol and then a meat tree is very honorable, or does that seem kind of wasteful and kind of stupid, right? So there's actual evidence that there was actually these meat trees and lakes of alcohol. Seems kind of wasteful and kind of weird, right? So if you're just wasting resources and you're not treating your people right, your mandate would be taken away, and so then it gives legitimacy to another family to be able to take control. Good. What else? What else did you guys see in that video? What about their origin story? Talked about it, right? Two rivers. And who is that person that controlled the rivers? You the engineer, right? So this guy, he started digging holes, dikes, dams, different things to control the river. So they have an origin story of their civilization, right? What else? What about their writing? What did they write on? Okay, stone, paper. What about the bones? Did you guys see the bones? They talked about the bones, how they would write on the bones and ask things of the god. We'll get more into that later. What else? There's one other thing. Anything? No?
But you want to go back some years and they're saying, you're talking about, the guy being crazy and how wild it was, he's crazy. How many of you ever seen like movie stars today that were like teenagers and they're really famous and then all of a sudden they get to be in their 20s and 30s, Miley Cyrus, and they go wow because everybody thinks Britney Spears, all those other ones that are kind of there. They never had a childhood. They weren't like you that got to grow up in a progression. They were thrust into something different. Does that make sense? So a lot of these rulers, I mean, it's not unheard of for a kid that's 16 years old, just like in Egypt, to all of a sudden become the ruler of everything. He's not mentally or physically ready for that, but he has to do it because that's the family's role. So by the time that he never develops those things, there's a good chance that he went power crazy, didn't ever grow through adolescence, didn't ever have the maturity to figure out how to do stuff, and then all of a sudden they go wild in the brain because they were thrust into that spotlight. So that's a lot of stuff there.
There's actually instances where they would have babies that were technically the ruler. Yeah, they'd actually have like a baby that was like 3 to 4 years old that would actually be considered the ruler of the kingdom. They'd have advisors. They'd have people that take care of them. But yeah, there's also instances because of that, queens would start taking over and start using their children's power as a way to gain more power. So you have this weird like hierarchical system that would, I would tell you to do more research. It's very complex and it's very cool to read. If you ever want to get into stuff like this, because the dynasties themselves are very interesting. They're all a chasm of chaos, control, and religion. It's very interesting. So China is considered like the rest of them, a river society, but we call it river dynasties because of their dynastic system. It's something that shapes them, their history. So it's geography. Do you guys know where China is located, right? It's a pretty big area. It's surrounded by what's to the right of China or to the east of China? The Pacific Ocean, right? So they have an ocean on one side. So the geography is they have an ocean on one side. To the north, there's mountains, and there's also rivers and stuff. We'll get into that in a second. So the Hanghe, or the Yellow River, is to the north, and then you have the Yangtze, which is to the south. Which they're both important, but we mostly just talk about the Yellow River. They both, like Mesopotamia, like Egypt, like the Indus River Valley, have flooding cycles that flood the land, fertilize the land, deposit silt, and then once the flooding recedes, then now you plant on that flooded land. So you have that. You still have that similar system. Like this is why they gathered around these rivers. So the environmental challenges. So do you think it's easy to set up a civilization if it's constantly getting destroyed? No, it's not easy. If you set up a town and then the next day it's destroyed, there's no foundation. You have no foundation. So this Yu, when he controlled by canals, by dikes and dams, actually made it where China could finally start developing a complex civilization because it wasn't destroyed all the time. So geographic isolation. How do you think they were isolated? Mountains. We have the water to the east. So we'll talk about this in a second. So there was also an oceans, mountains to the north. There was a desert to the west. So they were pretty much isolated from everybody. So they developed a lot of things independently from other nations. They also, since of this isolation, they started trading amongst themselves. So this is why they didn't get iron working until later, until a couple thousand years after everybody else, because they were isolated. Did you guys see, it did say that there was evidence of the Silk Road being a thing even back in 600 BC. See, that's significant because that shows that there wasn't just stagnation of them. They were actually trading with the outside world. So they developed a complex trade system. What were they trading? Silk. You think silk's pretty important, right? There's a whole road based off of it. So did anybody know like how sacred silk was to them? Does anybody know what they would do to you? So silk was so important to the trade for China that if you were caught transferring silkworms, methods of making silk, things like that, you'd be put to death immediately. No questions asked. Even if you were innocent, they just put you to death because they figured if they could keep it from spreading to the outside world, they could keep this lucrative market in China. So it was one of the most lucrative markets around the world. So Yu was the first of the Yang, I think it's the Zai dynasty. Did I say it? But so this one was that first dynasty I talked about. There's not a lot written about this dynasty. Everything we know about it was written later by other dynasties and other writers in the past. But it's considered the first dynasty, but they don't directly say it was a dynasty. It's kind of back and forth between is it real, is it not real. What they believe is that it was a conglomeration of culture that they just called a dynasty. So like a cultural group. So Chinese culture was developing at this point, so they called it a dynasty. We talked about Yu controlling floods. The first official dynasty was the Shang dynasty, which started about 1700 BC and it lasted to about 1000 BC. And they're one of the first ones to actually leave written record for us, so we know what was happening. Early cities. So early cities were built of wood. The upper class lived inside, the poor lived outside, and they had city walls, right? Why do you think the upper class lived inside? Protection. What else? What's located inside the city? Temples. Government buildings. What else? Think like better shops, artisans. You have people of higher status, people that make things. So there was a trade network with inside cities. There was production inside cities that they wanted access to. So they kept it specifically for them. What about outside? Why do you think they put the poor on the outside? Because you don't really care about them, right? You're inside the walls. The poor is supposed to, they fend for themselves. So you kind of you see this division of classes based on wealth and prestige. So Chinese civilization, they believed that they were the center of the world. Everybody else was just uncivilized and barbaric. How long, in the video, how long did it say that the Chinese dynasties lasted? Yeah, but how long did it last to the modern day? 1911. So 1911 Cs. So that means they were around even when the U.S., the Chinese dynastic system was around even when the U.S. was created and even into the modern era. You guys know what the Boxer Rebellion is by any chance? I don't know if you guys have ever heard about the Boxer Rebellion. But anyways, it's up to that period. That's when the decline of the Chinese dynasty happened, about 1911. And so even when Great Britain was conquering the world, the English were conquering the world, they even considered them still barbarians and uncivilized, or lesser to them. And so since they kind of grew up in an isolated area and built, they thought they were the only things in the world for the longest time that mattered, at least. So they had this group mentality. Who else did we talk about that had a group mentality in their culture? Talked about them yesterday, the day before that. Huh? Romans, a little bit, yes. So we talked about how the Indus River Valley, they had a communal system, right? We talked about Mesopotamia with their communal system and how the community would take care of things. What do you think is significant about community over individualism? There's more of them, okay? So more thoughts, more ideas, right? What else? You can prosper more. Things get done on a communal level. Yes. What else? Well, yeah, there's more people to trade with. Things are done at a communal level, and so things get done faster and more efficient. I wouldn't say more efficiently. They get done faster. There's more ideas being spread, so stuff like that. What type of modern day thing can we think of communal ideas, like this idea of community? Family, good. What else? Church. That's a good example. So you have your church community. When somebody's something happens to somebody, everybody gets together to help that one person. So that one person is not just left out. They actually have a support system. And so that's what's good about community involvement in society. So family, how did they state how family is set up? Is it a patriarchy or a matriarchy? If you guys know what those means word. So a patriarchy is when the man is considered the dominant. A matriarchy is when the female or the woman is considered dominant. So it's a patriarchy, right? So it's a rigid patriarchy based on what? Talked about this a little earlier. Starts with an H. So they have a family system based on respect and honor, right? I said that in the video. It's based, and it also is based on age. We talked about that earlier. So you were supposed to respect the people above you, the king. It had that 5 system. You're supposed to respect your king, your mother, your father, stuff like that. So in this idea is that the eldest male controlled everything. So the eldest male in the family controlled everything. So you honor the father, you honor your mother. Similar ideas that we see in today's culture, or even in biblical culture also. Honor your father, your mother, right? So family is centered on a social institution, respect parental values. Eldest male control family property. So we see an inheritance system where the eldest male would control the land, the property, and the wealth after their father had died. And so since it's a patriarchal society, women were expected to obey all men, even their sons. Social classes. So kings and warrior nobles led society and owned land. All right. So you have a king, and then you have nobles that own land that they were given food from the king. This is called feudalism. We'll talk about that in a second. Religious beliefs. So they believed in this idea of the ancestral, like your ancestors' are important. So if you didn't honor your ancestors correctly, you could bring misfortune to your family. You could dishonor your family. All right. And so what they did, the way they talked to the elders and talked to the gods, is they would etch this writing onto tortoise shells or animal bones, and they would throw it into fires, and however that fire cracked the bones would answer the question. They have an oracle that could read the actual cracks in the bone. That's like shamanistic. What do you think of that as shamanism? Do you guys know what shamanism is? What a shaman basically is, what shamanism is religion based on rituals and ritual happenstance and the natural world, stuff like that. That's what shamanism is. So this would be a form of shamanism. So these oracle bones were used to consult gods, ancestors, and then the supreme god Shangdi, which would be like the king of all their gods. All right. All right. So we talked about it talked about in the video that this writing that they put on to these oracle bones is still part of Chinese culture, right? It's still part of the Chinese writing system, which is crazy to consider something happened 5,000 years ago is still inside their writing. Does anybody know what Chinese writing looks like? Bunch of lines, symbols, stuff like that. Here, I'll show you give you a little picture of what it looks like. So right there. So each of these little symbols or like characters means something. Just like on how like when we write a word, it means something. This means multiple things. It can mean a person, a place, a thing. It can mean an idea. They all mean different things. All right. but there's a lot of them. There's a ton of different characters. It's really hard to learn, and it's really broken up into there's two Chinese dialects that are the main ones, which is Mandarin and Cantonese, and they're both pretty complex. It's actually considered one of the hardest languages to learn. So is English is probably considered pretty hard to learn also because our language is actually pretty weird compared to other languages. But it is a very hard language to learn because it has a lot of characters, a lot of words that mean different things. The Zhao take control. So about 1000 BC, the Zhao dynasty takes control of China. So we have the transfer of the mandate of heaven, like we talked about earlier. So the mandate of heaven is believed that that a just ruler has divine approval to be able to rule. Developed a justification to change the power to Zhao. So the mandate of heaven was created as a means to transfer power like religiously. So it meant something. The gods actually wanted this to happen instead of the man just doing what they wanted. And this developed the dynastic cycle, which would rise and decline. So a family would come and kill another family to try to take control. And it was this long period of just fighting. And this fighting period is called the warring periods or the spring and autumn periods, right? A lot of fighting, and we'll talk about why. So the reason for this is feudalism. Does anybody know what feudalism is? In like a basic form. Or have you heard of feudalism in other cultures or other time periods? So the best way to realize what feudalism is, do you guys know what like in the medieval times, how was it sectioned off? Does anybody know?
I thought like people worked for food.
So like they had peasants, right? They had peasants that were that had like a noble or like a lord. So it's very similar to that. So the way it would work is you have the king and the king is in the middle. He owns all this land, right? So this is the king's land, all right? So he can divvy off his land to people he likes. So let's say he likes he has an uncle that he loves. So now it's a vassal. So now he's given land, which gives power for him to take control of that land, that area. All right, so he has a general that he really liked. This general did a lot of good things for him. So now he's going to give him this piece of land. So now he has a brother that he thinks should have some land, but he doesn't like him that much, so he's going to give him a little bit of land, right? And then he has a big general that did a lot for him, and so he has this land. So the way this would work is power was based off of from the king giving you land. And so land, you can gather resources, trade between one another, create armies. So this idea was that you were given land for exchange of services and taxes. So you paid your taxes, you gave men for the king to fight. If he wanted something, you gave it to him. But over time, people like this, who have all this land and all this power, would get very power hungry. And maybe there's a bunch of little tiny vassal states along this border. And he's like, oh, I want all that. So he'd start taking control. So now this is that vassal's stuff. And so what this happened is it created power vacuums. And you'd have these two factions would back the king against this faction. And so you had these this warring period where factions would play against each other, fight against each other. They'd depose the emperor and put new puppet emperors in. So you had this long period of just fighting different emperors and the transfer of power. So that's why there's so many dynasties in China. So the Zhao dynasty built roads. What do you think is important about roads? What do roads help you do? Trade. What else? You get places faster, yes. Do you know exactly where you're going when you take a road? Usually, you have an idea where you're going. Instead of aimlessly walking through the forest trying to figure out, well, that's east and I think that's west. So you're figuring out these, you're better capable of finding locations for trade so it's faster because you're not just aimlessly walking through the wilderness. So coinage. What did their coins look like? Knives and what else? Spades. What does that kind of signify? What does that show you just by their coinage? What type of culture are they? What does a knife represent? Fighting. So they're a warlike culture. So they have their money reflects that. What about a spade? What do you use a spade for? Farming, right? So they're also an agricultural culture. So their coinage kind of reflects the type of culture they are. Does that make sense? What about iron? What does iron help them do? everything, right? Helps you fight better, helps you build better, helps you produce crops better, does a little bit of everything better. It's stronger than bronze, and it's better than stone tools, so it helps increase the productivity of a civilization. So the periods of the war in state, we talked about this. It was peaceful, but at the same time, it wasn't peaceful. It's considered peaceful because it was stable, but it was just a bunch of people murdering each other and moving. The Liaoyang becomes the capital because of all this, these nomads attacking the Zhao. These nomads would basically be what we consider Mongols now, or from the western part of China. And that is it on that one. Any questions? Does anybody have any questions about ancient China? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so talking about like the king giving off his land, so after he gives it off, does he still like own it?
So technically, yes. So he still owns this land, but it's still owned by this vassal. And so the reason he owns this land is because he controls this vassal. So he doesn't directly own the land, but he indirectly owns the land.
Like leasing.
Yeah, it's like leasing.
Maybe your dad, they lease a deer place or anything like that. The person still owns it, but they get to keep that land for as long as that person allows them to stay on it. And they had a loyalty to the king, and that's one of the main reasons. Like, the king owned all the land. So the only way you could make money by farming was to have land. So then it pyramided scheme down, pyramided scheme down, pyramided scheme down. They just kept paying back to the king.
So interesting about that, there'd actually be vassals within vassals. So this vassal would actually have other vassals within itself. So like different provinces within their own land. And so this was like a large system that got really nitty gritty, very complex. Because this vassal would have a vassal, but then this vassal would have towns inside of it that would be the vassals of that town's vassal. It gets very confusing.
And why do you think the king would give away some of his land? Why would anybody?
It's hard to control.
Okay, so let's say this. Let's say Westbrook is the king of this class. Okay, Westbrook's going to do something that's going to make y'all guys mad, right? So then instead of having 30 people go beat up Westbrook and then have to go through another king and another king and another king, Westbrook's like, hey, Butchie, how are you handling your business? I'm going to give you some land over here. Give me a little protection. Hey, Coach, I'm going to give you a little land. Give me a little protection. Well, those guys needed protection, so they gave away land. And those guys needed protection, so they gave away land. Until it was just the poor people left that didn't have any protection. You know what I mean? And then they relied on the other people. To be honest with you, I mean, the same thing if feudalism goes all the way back to how drugs are done today. You know what I mean? When they pawn off, they pawn off, they pawn off. It's the same way of how a big business is done. CEOs make a ton of money. They pawn off, they pawn off, they pawn off. It just kind of keeps going in this cycle.
So you guys do have a quiz. It's on there. To remind you, you do have a map quiz tomorrow, so I would study for that.